Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this edition of the National EAP HR Expert Series. I'm very excited to have Thomas Wassel and Cecilia Erzman of Cullen & Dykman on the line with us to talk to us about creating a workplace violence policy. Thomas is a partner at Cullen & Dykman. He has been advising employers on a wide range of labor and employment law matters since 1983. And Cecilia is an associate in commercial litigation department at Cullen & Dykman with a focus on labor and employment-related litigation. So they've created a wonderful presentation for us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to add those into the question section on the side of your screen. And Thomas and Cecilia, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to everybody this afternoon. Although we're here to talk about sort of an unpleasant topic, which is workplace violence. Workplace violence is in the news on a regular basis. When it's in the news, it's usually an extreme form of workplace violence. We've all seen the shocking headlines and the tragedies that take place. It has a much bigger impact, though. There's much more to workplace violence than just mass shootings or former employees wreaking havoc at their former place of employment. We'll talk in a minute about what different types of workplace violence, what different types there are. According to OSHA, there are 2 million victims or thereabouts every year of workplace violence, and billions and billions of dollars, 121 billion according to OSHA in the most recent year, is as a result of workplace violence. Workplace violence leads to unhappy employees, and unhappy employees are unproductive employees. And unhappy employees tend to have a higher level of absenteeism. They may have increased health care costs, whether it's from any sort of physical damage that occurs in the workplace, or just the mental strain of having to deal with what we're going to call workplace violence. And of course, if there are lawsuits involved, there are legal fees involved in that. There are the costs of trying to come up with policies and do internal investigations, and if necessary, terminating or disciplining employees and replacing them. So there are all sorts of related costs that come from having violence in the workplace. Now, we use that term, workplace violence, and it actually covers a broad spectrum of potential acts. As I mentioned earlier, on the extreme one side, on the right side of this particular chart, if you should all be able to see on your screens, you have things like people engaging in actual physical violence, ranging up to shooting and stabbing, or it could also be something like punching or some other type of physical violence. But let's move to the other side of the scale for a couple of moments anyway, and talk about the low end. And disruptive or hostile conduct, sometimes people call that bullying. And I know bullying is kind of a buzzword. It's often talked about. And what is bullying? Well, it is sort of what we describe here on the slide. And interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly for some people, bullying is not illegal. It is not illegal to have a boss who is demeaning, loud, obnoxious, and generally a horrible human being. As long as the boss is not discriminating, in other words, only taking things out or being hostile to people of a particular age, race, creed, color, sex, national origin, etc., being a wall-to-wall SOB towards all of your employees is not against the law. I don't recommend it as a management strategy, but there's not a legal remedy for that. We'll talk about what issues do arise in the context there. As things get more serious and you move to the more intimidating, frightening aspects, that's where you really have issues with employees who are afraid to come to work, who are afraid to perform their jobs. The violence actually the types of violence, again, whatever the degree of violence from low to high, can fall into 4 different categories as well. It could be violence by strangers, meaning somebody walks in off the street and engages in some sort of workplace violence that there was no way to prepare for, or, well, there was no way to anticipate, let's put it that way. Or sometimes people come in off the street and they commit a robbery and get out quickly. You could have customers or clients who do have a right to be on the property, engaging in some sort of violent or possibly unlawful conduct while they're on the property. You have, of course, coworkers, the employees themselves, engaging in that kind of conduct. And sometimes you can even have personal relations. So you have an employee who's on the job and a spouse decides to walk into the workplace and create a scene. All of these do occur in the workplace, and all of these are issues that employers have to try and address on a day-to-day basis for the good of the enterprise. Now, as we said earlier, at least I mentioned it in terms of bullying, there's no federal law that says thou shalt not have workplace violence or thou shalt not allow bullying. But there are some laws that sort of touch the edges of this and can create liability for employers. Full disclosure, we represent employers rather than employees in cases. Under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which everybody knows as OSHA, an employer is obligated to guarantee or furnish to employees a place of employment free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious harm to the employees. Now, does that mean that any employer can guarantee that there will never be any sort of workplace violence? Of course not. There are no guarantees in life, and employers are not insurers. They can only take reasonable steps. And really that's what OSHA requires, that employers take reasonable steps and establish reasonable guidelines to prevent and, if necessary, investigate after the fact when workplace violence takes place. As I mentioned before, if the violence or bullying is based on discrimination, the various forms of discrimination that are covered by federal or applicable state law, that there's a duty there. Employers may have premises liability, just the normal liability in tort or property law of a landlord or owner of property to preserve a safe environment for guests of the property. There could be basic negligence that we negligently allow someone we know to be violent to work here. And then, of course, there's the concept of respondeat superior. We lawyers love our Latin. And that basically means that an employer is responsible for the acts of its employees if the employees are acting within the scope of their employment. Now, when you have an employee who's engaging in some sort of intentional act, you have one employee who punches another employee, for example, that's obviously an intentional act. An employer wouldn't be liable under theories of respondeat superior there because that's not within the scope of employment. But what if the employer knows or has reason to know that there's an employee who has violent tendencies, that is likely to or has threatened to punch another employee, or maybe has done it in the past and you have concern about them doing it in the future? Well, if the employer does nothing, then the employer could be deemed to be liable. So the test in many ways is similar to the kinds of tests when racial or sexual discrimination has taken place. If the employer doesn't have reasonable preventative measures in place and doesn't take reasonable steps to remedy violations of those policies, then the employer can have liability. So all employers should have a workplace violence policy in place. It's foolish not to have one, and all employers that we advise have something like that in their employee manuals or in their set of policies if they don't have an actual book that they call a manual. But the policy should have, again, this is somewhat similar in many ways or conceptually to an anti-harassment or anti-discrimination policy. There should be a means for employees to make complaints about workplace violence, which again can range. It could be simple bullying. It doesn't have to be the headline-grabbing types of violence. Employees should have the ability to make complaints. They should be told who complaints can be made to, and there generally should be more than one person. But well, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. My colleague is going to really talk about what goes into the policy. So I'll turn it over to her in a moment. But it's really important for an employer to have this policy to assure employees that it is not acceptable, that the employer doesn't tolerate it, and the employer will take appropriate remedial action if something takes place. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Cecilia to follow up on creating a workplace violence policy.
So listening to everything Tom said and how wide this issue can be, it can seem like a very daunting process to create a policy that protects the employer from liability, but also provides a safe environment to the employees to the extent possible. So we're going to go through now just some things that typically should be in a policy that can help address all these issues. So a good way to start is through an objective statement. So what is the purpose of this new policy that's coming into place? So you could just simply state something along the lines of the company is committed to preventing workplace violence and maintaining a safe work environment for all employees. You can even go a little further and say, based on society and the increasing violence in society, the company thinks it's important to put a policy in place to handle instances of intimidation, harassment, or other threats of or actual violence. So that's always a good place to start, and it kind of leads into what this is going to do for your employees. But then the next question is, who exactly does this apply to? Does it apply to full-time, part-time, vendors, any temporary workers you might have on your premises? So you could make it very wide and just say all persons involved in the company's operation, including but not limited to personnel, contract temporary workers, etc. The next thing is really a best practice kind of thing. It's called the zero tolerance policy. So you state right up front for your employees that as an employer, you're going to have zero tolerance for violence in your workplace. So if a person engages in or threatens violence, actual violence could lead to immediate termination for cause. Threats could lead to very serious consequences as well. So the next question, of course, and a question that anyone would ask right away is, well, what is considered workplace violence? And Tom went through this with that, spectrum chart. So clearly it's a very broad array of behaviors. So a good thing to do would be to define workplace violence pretty broadly so that you encompass all these things, but then provide a list of examples so that your employees can identify what actually would be considered violent. So example is you could say below is a list of behaviors. It's not all-inclusive, but it includes actions such as shoving, pushing, harassing, intimidating, causing physical injury, making threatening remarks, intentionally damaging property, bringing an unauthorized weapon, committing acts motivated by either domestic violence, sexual harassment, different things along those lines. So Tom touched on it a little bit before, but having a policy is great, but you need to have a reporting procedure in place. Otherwise, there's no way for employees to bring this up to the employer so that the employer can meet his duty or her duty, its duty, of making sure that the environment is safe. So what is your reporting procedure? Is the person going to report to their supervisor? If the supervisor is the problem, do they report to the department head? And then sometimes some companies even develop a special interdisciplinary team that handles this so that that would be the person the employee reports to. So who does that? And you might also want to include here information about confidentiality, that reports of violence will be kept confidential to the extent that they can be. You might want to include some record keeping, just how you'll keep these records to make sure you have a trail if somebody is exhibiting violent behaviors over and over again. Again, that would fall right into you have a reasonable belief to believe that something could happen, and it heightens the employer's liability there to make sure that the environment is safe. So that's just another thing that can be added in. And also just have a thing in place for the investigation process. When the report's made, the employer has a duty to investigate to see the validity behind that report. And if you don't investigate, obviously, there's no bite to your policy, so it'll fall away. I think, hold on. Sorry, a little technical difficulty. There we go. So as we said before, though, and as shown on that spectrum chart, not only are actual acts of violence something that we should be thinking about, but we should also be thinking about threats and how we identify threats. So as an employee, if you're not trained in this, it can be very difficult to discern, okay, well, what constitutes a threat? So again, a good way to go about this is, of course, to provide training, but in your policy to say, here's, a little bit of some examples of what this could look like. So examples of what could be threatening behavior is discussing weapons or displaying overt signs of extreme stress, resentment, hostility, anger, making threatening remarks to people, displaying irrational or inappropriate behaviors. So these types of things can be listed out to kind of give employees an idea of what could be risky behavior that eventually might lead to an actual event of violence. Next, of course, as in many other types of policies, is the non-retaliation clause, just having it in there to assure people that if they make a good faith report, they won't be subject to retaliation. So the bite to every policy, the enforcement, and this is a good place to once again restate your zero tolerance for violence policy and just lay out if it's an overt act of violence, the employer can terminate you for cause immediately, threats, everything will be investigated, and even for people who aren't working for the company, you can put in here that if they come on premises and commit an act of violence or a threat of violence, that the authorities will be contacted and they'll be handled that way. Another good thing to do is to put in just some information about your employee assistance program. This is really a great program that can help employees sort through a lot of things in a confidential manner and diffuse situations. So reminding employees of this service and encouraging them to use it can really help in promoting a safe environment. And of course, at the end, making sure your employees sign an acknowledgement and receipt. This way, God forbid something happens in the future, you have a record that they saw this policy and they were aware of what it said and the mandates of it. So now having a workplace violence policy can be accompanied by various other things as well, which can help promote a safe environment. So one thing you can do is revisit how applicants are screened for hiring. Of course, be aware of your state's discrimination laws and make sure any way that you are choosing to up your screening complies and isn't discriminatory. You can also create emergency plans. So have a plan that sets out where do you go for safety in different situations. And in these safe places, how will the company have a roll call to make sure the people are all there and everyone's safe? And in what situations do you contact the employer's security team versus the police? So having a policy that lays this out for more extreme overt violence situations can really make a difference. And then another thing is implement security measures. Look around and see, is the parking lot lighted properly? Are there access codes to get in? Do people need identification cards? Just simple security measures can also help both locking down a building to ensure safety and ensuring that your people are safe on your own premises. And finally, another thing which I touched on before is establishing a crisis management or threat assessment team. And this team would, again, it's best practice to have them be from various disciplines throughout the company. So, the employees have access to who would their department head would be, for example. And this team can be specially trained to handle these situations. And we'll conclude with the employer must-dos. So if you have a violence policy but you don't distribute it, what good is it? So make sure that you at least semi-annually or annually distribute your workplace violence policy. It can be a standalone policy or it can be in your employee handbook, but make sure everyone's aware of it and have those acknowledgement forms signed. So the next is the buzzword, the training, training, training. So you can have a policy in place and people can have it in their hands, but if they don't know how to use it and if they aren't taught to use it, odds are they might not know how to use it. So for the employees, it's really important to have a training that encourages them to report, that helps them walk through what is a threat, what is an actual act, go through the spectrum, because a lot of people don't know that bullying can be an act of violence. A lot of people with the media and society today instantly jump to the more extreme version. But the employer, by making employees aware through training, can potentially stop behaviors from becoming even more overtly violent by recognizing and encouraging employees to report the less severe ones. So that's important for the employees, but also whoever is the person that's going to receive this report, whether it's supervisors, managers, if you have a crisis management team, giving them the skills to learn how to deal with these situations, being versed in the reporting procedures so they can help employees report, and also knowing how to diffuse serious situations. So those two types of trainings on both ends are really important to having a policy that actually works. And finally, the drills, actually doing what your policy states. So letting employees know how will they be informed if there's a violent situation. Is it going to be email, cell phone use? And then where do they go? Where's the designated safe area? Maybe actually taking them there and doing a drill so that they see where to go, they know what hallways to use. That can be very efficient, very useful. And finally, if it's a very severe instance, what's the evacuation plan? And just walking through it and knowing who's going to do the roll call, where, and how to contact the police or anything along those lines.
So just a couple of general thoughts here based on our experience with employers. Employers know, or should know and should remember, that in most states, including New York State where we practice, employees are considered to be employees at will, which means that employers can discipline or discharge employees for good reason, bad reason, any reason, or no reason at all, as long as it's not for an unlawful reason, such as discrimination or certain other types of protected activity. So when employers are faced with issues of bullying, they have, to some extent, free rein to do what they believe is appropriate. An employee can't say, you fired me, and even though I didn't do anything bad, you didn't have just cause. If they're not as part of a unionized workforce with a collective bargaining agreement or civil service or something like that, the employer has the right to act as it needs to. As I mentioned at the outset, what you might call milder forms of workplace violence, bullying, the laws don't address it directly. The Supreme Court has specifically said that the discrimination laws are not a code of civility. There is no law that requires people to be nice to one another. How nice they must be to one another, that's up to the employer and up to enforcement on the part of the employer. Again, unhappy employees are not productive employees, and it's hard to retain employees who are unhappy. It's hard to recruit if you have a reputation for having unhappy employees. So from a practical, legal, and productivity standpoint, it makes sense for every employer to address workplace violence issues sooner rather than later. If anyone has questions, I believe there's a way for you to post them online, and we'd be happy to answer them. Well, I guess then we will, if there are no other questions, I would just conclude by urging you to adopt the policy. If need be, have your HR attorney vet the policy for you to make sure that it covers the situations that needs to be covered. That policy must be shown to employees, distributed to employees. Do not hide your light under a bushel, as the saying goes, because a policy that's not disseminated to employees and is just kept in some HR manager's desk drawer is not worth the paper it's written on, either for protection from legal liability or for helping to preserve a safe and contented workforce, which is the goal of every employment, every employer, I should say. And we thank you for attending.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I wanted to thank you as well. I think it was a great presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I hope that everyone else will as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.